we are going to talk about Starcraft II, Heart of the Swarm. How hard could it be? The story of a cinematic. So I wanted to take one of the cinematics, one of the in-game cinematics from Heart of the Swarm, and look at a series of animatics that we used in making it in order to track through the story and the feedback we received and how we dealt with that feedback and what we addressed and what we were never quite able to address. So we'll get into all of that stuff in a moment. I should introduce myself. I'm Brian Kindregan. I was the lead writer on Starcraft II, Heart of the Swarm. Co-lead writer on Wings of Liberty. Senior writer on Mass Effect 2, and a storyboard artist in the film industry for many, many years. I'm currently the lead writer on the Diablo in one way or another for almost 2 decades. And I should point out that I'm the one up here talking about all of the stuff that went into the story in this cinema a lot, because Blizzard is a very team-based, has a very team-based culture and is very collaborative. And there was a core creative team that worked on this cinematic. So and for all the terrible mistakes we made, I wasn't the only one. So I think any talk about cinematics has to start with the question, why cinematics? In recent years in games, there's been this kind of movement towards telling the story in the game through gameplay and not asking the player to. That makes a lot of sense. That's a good movement. But it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There actually is a very strong case to be made for cinematics in certain types of games, and StarCraft is one of those. Because StarCraft is an RTS, and so your basic gameplay camera is this omniscient, view. You're looking down at everything. And when you look down at stuff visually, you tend to sort of, it becomes a little bit less relevant. StarCraft challenges you intellectually in the gameplay, but that camera view tends to disassociate you from the emotions of what's going on. So you're sending thousands of your little Marines or Zerglings into battle, and they're dying, and you're not necessarily emotionally reacting to that, other than going, damn it, I've got to build more. So the cinematics tend to bring you down to eye level in this world, and they're sort of story writ large. They give you a connection to the events in the world. And then when you go and play a map, you bring that connection with you. So it's not that they're 2 separate modes. There is a sort of synthesis that goes on. It allows you to see the world in a different way and bring that knowledge and that view into the map. And likewise, it humanizes the characters. The characters on an RTS map are an inch high, and you can't see their faces, and they're probably going to die very quickly. So we need to find a way, at least for certain characters whose story we want you to character. So in a cinematic, you can see the facial expression, you can understand the conflicts and the things that a character is struggling with. And then when you see that same character on the map, an inch high, and you can't see their face, once again, you bring that with you. So you already have that investment. There's even more reasons for cinematics. They offer maximum impact. And what I mean by that is there's a cinematic in Heart of the Swarm. It's not the one we'll be looking at today, but there's one where some battle cruisers come out of the dark and start assaulting a base, and the camera is down low, sort of like you're in the base. And that gives you a very strong sense of what it's like to be in a base that's being attacked by some battle cruisers coming out of orbit. That's not something you can get on the map, because you're looking down at the battle cruiser and the thing it's much later, where your army is under constant assault from these battle cruisers. And hopefully that huge impact that you felt when you through. And finally, and this to me is the most important one from a storytelling perspective, is that they're high profile. And what I mean by that is We throw story at the player in many, many different ways in the course of an RTS campaign. It's not that we put all the story in the cinematic and let it. In briefings, we have debriefings that tell story. There's all sorts of stuff in story mode that the player can click on. So with story coming at the player all the time in a variety of different ways, it sort of becomes important to have a background hierarchy that the player can plug into and understand the importance of the story that's being given to them in method X or method Y. So if there's something in story mode that you can click on and it's just it's just some random thing, and you can bypass it and never click on it, then the player will sort of inherently sense that they're not going to that one thing. If it's important enough that they need to know it, we'll find a way to put it in front of them. But even then, there's a lot of different ways we can put stuff in front of you. We can have someone say it on a map. But the amount of story we can tell in a mission or on a map is very, very small. I found that if I have a line of dialogue in a map that fires 4 or 5 times, a great many people will play the entire map and swear that that line never fired. They just never heard it. Or maybe they heard it once. And this extends to me. I play tested an entire map once to hear how one of the lines would fire in a certain moment. But I happened to be in a pitched firefight when the line fired, and I completely missed. I finished the map and then went, oh, what happened to that line? So we have very limited story that we can tell. However, when we put the story in a scripted scene, like a briefing or a debrief, we're telling the player, this is important. We're trying to make you look at it. You can hit escape to get out of it, of course, but we're trying to make you look at it. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a huge, impactful moment when the story turns. So we reserve that for the cinematics. So when we put story content in a cinematic, we're telling the player, this is very important. You have to watch this, not just to understand what's going to happen later, but because the story is going to actually turn. So it serves as a way to indicate what kind of story the player is about to get. So OK, so now that we know why we have cinematics, which cinematic are we going to talk about today? I wanted to talk about hopes and fears. So that's the first in-game cinematic in Heart of the Swarm. So when you install the game, you get an opening pre-render, and we'll look at a little bit of that later. But you get the opening pre-render, you press campaign, the campaign starts, and you get hopes and fears. So it's a good one to talk about for a couple reasons. Mainly that it was the most difficult cinematic in the game from a storytelling perspective. There were cinematics where I did one draft of the script, and the director, Ben Dye, did one pass at the animatic, and off it went, and it was great, and it was glorious, and we said, this cinematic of challenges, a lot of things that were stacked against it. And so we had to sort of define what victory looked like in making that a good cinematic. And I'll get into all of the things that made it difficult in just a moment. The other thing is because it was so drafts of the script, and I mean drafts from the ground up. And Ben and his really talented team did probably as many versions of the animatic. So it's great to look at because we have a lot of material that we can examine and sort of track through how the story evolved. So the first thing that we have to understand about why Hopes and Fears was so difficult is the kinds of questions the player had when the cinematic started. So they already had some questions. So to understand that, let's first look very briefly at how Wings of Liberty ended.
Jim?
It's okay. I got you.
All right, and that's it. We're out. So the story of Wings of Liberty, in very simple form, was that this guy, Jim Raynor, was going to set out to do the impossible. No one thought he could do it, but at a certain point in the story, he decided that he was going to somehow rescue Sarah Kerrigan from being the Queen of Blades, the leader of the evil alien Zerg swarm, a situation that was thrust upon her non-consensually, if you will. So the moment that he achieved that, he did the impossible, the story's over. I know, like in 10th grade English, we all learned about climax and denouement and wrap up the loose ends. But actually, certainly in a filmic sense, at the high point when you've achieved the thing the story's about, you're done. Get out. Over. So that's how Wings of Liberty ended, and that's exactly how it should have ended. There were a couple of questions hanging. An uneasy alliance with Prince Valerian, who was the son of his worst enemy, who also had a general working for him, General Warfield, who might be working for Valerian, but really owes his greater allegiance to Valerian's father. There was a giant battle going on. There was a lot of unanswered questions, and we didn't answer them. We ended the story there appropriately. So there's still a few questions hanging in the air when Heart of the Swarm starts, right? But we've got that opening pre-render. Surely that will cover everything and answer those questions for us. So let's look at the end of that opening pre-render.
For I am the Queen of Blades.
So that didn't really answer any questions. And once again, it did not answer questions appropriately. In other words, it should not have tried to answer questions. It's the pre-render. It plays when the game installs, and it has one job. It's to make you press the campaign button. Don't press multiplayer. Press the campaign. So it's trying to get you excited to play the Zerg campaign. And hey, Dustin. It did that very, very well. And it did that by asking a question, right? Where is she? What are those devices hanging over her? Is she in a lab? You know, what's going on? So it actually asked more questions. So that leaves us with hopes and fears. Now, you know, rolling out of this great pre-render cinematic, here comes the first, you know, lots and lots of questions hanging in the air. And that's generally a bad situation to go into with a cinematic. You want a cinematic that can pose questions or, you know, solve things that are really important to you for the player to care about. But when it comes to logistical questions, like how long has it been between the two games, and so another thing that Hopes and Fears had to do, another challenge, was it had to provide continuity between the two games. Most people, or many people at least, will play Wings of Liberty and then immediately go right into Heart of the Swarm. And we don't want there to be any sort of weird, abrupt disconnect. We had to make you feel like you were connecting the two games, and it was a smooth flow. So that was a challenge. And of course, like any cinematic, it can't be an info dump. As soon as the cinematic starts playing, you're on a timer to hit escape, even if the cinematic is still going. And once they do that, you've pretty much lost them. They're going to hit escape through the entire game. So we have to be very concise, and we can't just wander off into the weeds and try to dump as much info as we want. So, of course, that sort of contradicts the top thing on the list here, answering lots of questions. So another thing, before we actually get into the making of it, was that there were some priorities, some things that before we even started we knew were very important about this cinematic. And one is what I call the power shift. So Jim Raynor was our protagonist in Wings of Liberty. He was our point of view character. We identified, or at least empathized with him. In Heart of the Swarm, it's going to be Kerrigan. But whatever she is, she's your point of view character. You're going to follow her through this story, and you're supposed to see things from her point of view. So we needed to find a way to hand off the ball, right? For Raynor, we couldn't just start the story with Kerrigan as your point of view character, because a game with Raynor, they were invested in him, and we needed to find a way to switch over to Kerrigan. So that was something we knew needed to happen in this cinematic. And another thing was just setup. So this is the first storytelling moment in the game, and there's obviously going to be a lot of things that it needs to set up that will pay off throughout the campaign. So we needed to figure out how to set things up in an enjoyable, entertaining way. Because really, from a storytelling perspective, and then bam, the payoff, everyone enjoys that. Setting up is a lot harder, right? Because you're just putting something out there that will mean something later. But you want people to enjoy it and really going in. So with all of those challenges and all of those priorities, we had a script, a version of the script that we were happy-ish with. And Ben and his great team went away and made an animatic. So let's look at the very
Caution. Observation gate. Opening.
Your future together.
The girl you remember is dead. Go.
I moved heaven and earth to bring you back, Sarah. I can't watch you throw that away just for revenge.
Test phase 2.
All right, so, and by the way, I apologize. Obviously these animatics were never mixed to be played in a big room, so some of the dialogue you might have to cup your ear a little bit. And talking about what didn't work, and there's plenty, but one thing that I felt like had to work when I watched this, because the first time you watch an animatic, there's a magic thing that either happens or doesn't. You've written it, it all makes sense on the page, and then you watch it, and either it comes together and it's beautiful and it seems like it's going to work, or it totally does not, right? And so, but it's always going to be rough. So one thing I've started to do is I've kind of tried to identify a central idea for a cinematic. So when I watch the very first pass of the animatic, I'm just looking at that one thing. That central idea is the thing that has to work. If nothing else in a cinematic works, that central idea has to be there very early on. I guess I would call it the defensible center. As you evolve the cinematic, if you take parts out and add new parts and change things and whatever, you can do whatever you want to the cinematic as long as you don't break that central idea. And if you do put an idea in that breaks it, then you need to either take that idea back out, or you need to look at why your central idea is evolving, right? Perhaps you identified the wrong thing for this cinematic. So to me, what this cinematic was about, from a narrative sense, is that Jim represents hope, Sarah represents anger, and that's their central conflict. So this is all very important stuff, right? Jim was on a quest for revenge in Wings of Liberty, and then he was presented with a chance to get out, and instead of going and trying to kill someone for having done something bad to someone else, he could forget all of that and go path. Now, Sarah has gotten a second chance, and she is faced with a very similar choice, right? Jim comes to her and says, hey, let's go off to the planet of white picket fences and make babies, right? It'll be great. And faced with the same choice, Sarah does not choose the same path that Jim did. She is not interested in putting aside hatred and anger. There were terrible things that were done to her. There were terrible things that she did that were influenced by the terrible things that were done to her, which gives her guilt. She has this very strange cocktail of emotions going on, and all of that leads to, I really have to go kill someone. So, someone specific. So Sarah represents anger. And that conflict between them, the sort of vision that Jim paints of the future and the vision of the future that she sees, is the thing that is set in motion here that carries throughout the game. This is a broad arc that will play out over the course of the campaign. So it really has to work. OK, so what didn't work in that version of the animatic? Well, Jim feels like a defeated sad sack. Now, it's OK for a character, obviously, to suffer setbacks and suffer defeats and all of that. But people played Wings of Liberty as Jim, the scrappy guy who could always figure out a way to get things done. And then we see this without Valerian's doing experiments he didn't know about, and then Valerian allows him to have a moment alone with Sarah, and then Sarah beats him up, and he's just not the Raynor that people knew, and he's not a particularly exciting, dynamic character. So this was a big problem. We needed to fix that. I also thought the drama was not working. So that central conflict between them, I think, was there, inherent in the DNA of this thing. The drama, however, which is sort of the execution of that conflict, was not working. These two characters didn't feel like they're talking to each other. They were sort of talking past each other and throwing a series of one-liners at each other. And there was just no real sense that these two people were representing different visions of the future. And Sarah also was not working in this version. We gave her that moment at the end where once she knows that Jim can't see her anymore, she reveals her own vulnerability. And we knew we needed that, obviously. If she was going to just be this angry, hate, revenge character, that might be sort of compelling in a way, but I don't think you'd want to spend an entire campaign with them. You want to sense that this character has more depth to them and different sides. So we had that moment, but still, she was not coming off as a as a particularly deep character or someone who is validly struggling with something. It just felt like angry McHaterson Sarah. So we needed 2 slides for what didn't work in this version. So remember all the questions that we had to answer? Yeah, we didn't answer any of them. In fact, we posed a new one, the line where Jim says, you can't treat her like an animal. 2 minutes after the guard had said, you know the drill. People were very confused. They're like, did Jim not see all the other experiments they must have been performing on her? So we actually introduced questions. And the pace. This animatic is slow. Now, myself and Ben both had hoped that we had all this momentum coming off of the pre-render, right? You just watch Kerrigan and settle into the story of the game and let you, experience these characters a little bit. And it turned out we were exactly wrong on that. The momentum coming off of that pre-render meant that a lot of players felt like they should be invading a city now, absent any story reason for that in this cinematic. But we could at least be aware that the pace needed to be faster. We didn't have the time that we thought we would have. So a specific example of pacing problems, Jim's drinking. So this was something that Ben and I both wanted in this cinematic. And we had a couple of good reasons, right? One is we needed to provide continuity with Wings of Liberty. Well, in Wings of Liberty, there was this kind of theme, this running thing that Jim was an alcoholic. And right? So this actually provides continuity to Wings of Liberty. We close out that arc. And in fact, it's a payoff. In this cinematic that's almost all set up, here's a payoff. So that's great, And we had lots of good reasons for it. But it was interesting, as we went along, it just became harder and harder to justify this moment where he tries to drink on the elevator or takes out his flask. And so one way that sort of helped me come to grips with cutting it, if I was telling a story, right? So I just said, well, Jim's on an elevator and he's going to see Kerrigan. And along the way, he takes out his flask and decides not to drink. And then he goes and sees Kerrigan and paints this future of the two of them going off and having a happy life somewhere. And she tells him, no, it's not going to be that way. I'm going to go get revenge. And then they're pulled apart from each other, and she goes into this crazy lab test mode. When you tell the story like that, the whole alcohol thing is just weird. Why is that there? It has nothing to do with what's going on. So that was one that we had to cut for pace, and it improved the cinematic quite a bit. So along the way, I'm going to put up some lessons that we learned, and I think most of the lessons that you see, you're the fact is, a lot of us, everyone in this room does some kind of creative work, and the fact is you have some really hard-learned lessons that you learned along the way, and then later you forget them. Or you get into a creative fever dream, and you think maybe that thing you learned 10 years ago doesn't matter anymore. But it really does. So most of these are lessons that we sort of all already knew, but needed to learn again to be reminded. So this one is self-indulgence. Don't do it. So in the very first screening, I had a weird feeling about the drinking thing. I knew I liked it and I wanted it, but I was kind of like, it is a little off. And I kind of waited for someone else in the room to say, didn't, not in the first screening. And later, a lot of people started saying they didn't like it. But I found out that Ben had actually had the same exact feeling. He had that little voice going, that's kind of a weird beat, but I really like it. So both of us were being self-indulgent there, right? We should have just shot it in the head right there at that first meeting. But we didn't. We tried to keep something that we liked, even though we knew it wasn't specifically necessary. So there was a couple of competing priorities here. For me, one is to figure out how little characters can say. How few words can I get away with to make the story work? And that's a discipline I live with every day. But this was tough because Jim Raynor and Sarah Kerrigan have a storied relationship. There's so much water under that bridge, and And this is the first time we see them talk. There's so much on the table between these characters. There's so many things they have to say to each other. And I was sitting there with a script in front of me going, well, how can they not talk about this and that and the other? The fact is, again, with that self-indulgence thing, that's not what this Cinematica was about. If you look at the central idea, it's not about all of that stuff, and they couldn't talk about it. So it's just something that I struggled with. I had two competing priorities. And then just as a general one, I think that the whole team struggles with is the question of characters versus action in cinematics. These cinematics are big, glossy, expensive, and there will always be the question internally, and appropriately, why is there not more explosions and ninjas, right? So we had a cinematic here of two characters talking to each other and a little metal ball that gets broken. That was like the highlight of the action. So going in, we knew that we would have to justify the importance of this cinematic being two characters talking. So, OK, let's flash forward about 6 months and probably 7 or 8 animatics. 7 or 8 versions of the animatic. And let's watch another version and see how.
No visitors today, sir. Valerian's orders. Open the door, son.
Good morning, Commander.
Junior.
We'll begin in 2 minutes.
Make the most of this test. It's your last one. Now give us a minute.
Very well.
We're getting out of here tonight, darling.
Good. Then we can go after Minsk.
Forget Minsk. Forget all of it. This is about you and me.
There is no you and me.
I moved heaven and earth to bring you back, Sarah. I can't watch you throw that away just for revenge.
Test phase 2 commencing.
I never gave up on you, Sarah. Don't you give up on us!
All right, so what worked? This is Ben Dye's favorite topic. What we did is we put a series of barriers in front of Jim, or gave him a series of battles to fight, and he wins each one of them. So he confronts this giant Marine and tells him to open the door. And he opens the door. He gets to the bottom, and there's Valerian kind of like, oh, I guess you made it in, didn't you? And Jim informs Valerian that it's over. He's taking Kerrigan. And then he kicks Valerian and all of his guys out of the room. So he is fighting all of these battles and winning them. So now when he gets to Kerrigan, he thinks his fight is over, right? So Jim is coming off much tougher, which allows us to still make him lose the most important fight in the cinematic without feeling like working really well, is that power shift, that moment where the reins are handed over to Sarah Kerrigan. And in fact, the changes with Jim's entrance really help with that. So as I said, he wins all these battles, he gets to Kerrigan, he thinks the fight's over, he's just that's when he learns that Kerrigan does not share his vision of the future. And now Kerrigan takes over. And that shift completes when those doors close and Raynor's out of the cinematic. He's done. And we're still with Kerrigan. And we experience more story with Kerrigan. Now we feel like we've just naturally, we started the cinematic with Raynor and we ended with Kerrigan. So the power shift happened. And Jim and Sarah are working better. I don't think that they were completely perfect yet at this point, but now they feel like they're talking to each other and they're talking about real things and they are representing different views of how things should go. And finally, the pace. We cut out the alcohol bit. We trimmed a lot of stuff and we've tightened it up and it feels a lot tighter now. So still not perfect, but that is part of the process. So it's time for another lesson. The problem is never where you are. The moment when Jim is pounding on the glass, I never gave up on you, everyone would go, that's the moment. He's such a loser right here, that he is so weak and ineffectual. And so we looked at that moment over and over. We tried different lines. We tried different camera angles, different acting, different takes. And the truth is that that moment wasn't the problem. That moment was just where something that the viewer had been thinking for a while finally bubbled up, and they had the realization. But the reality was we had been telling you that Raynor was a loser. And that moment where Kerrigan rebuffs him was just, that was the cherry on top. So a lot of times when you get a lot of aggro on a particular moment in a cinema, a lot of times it's the foundations that you built earlier that are faulty. So what didn't work? There's still stuff that didn't work. There's still lots of questions. We're still not answering most of them. We're starting to get a little bit, there were questions about, well, what does Kerrigan think of Valerian, and what does Valerian think of Raynor, and all of these interpersonal questions. And just a little bit through their attitudes, we're starting to get some of that. But at this point, or soon thereafter, I think we finally realized we're just not going to be able to really address these questions in the cinematic. We're going to have to find another way to do it. If one of the questions is important enough, it's going to have to. Unfortunately, I was also the game writer. But so we came up with some text at the very beginning that would cover at least a few of the details. We added debriefs later. We found ways to squirrel that information away here and there. And anything that didn't make that cut, that we couldn't find a place for, then it couldn't have been important enough. So basically what I'm saying is still lots of questions, we punted. As far as the cinematic goes anyway. Also, the ending was not working. So the end of the cinematic, you can have any kind of tone you need had some emotional resonance, but it basically left most people feeling like, okay, I'm going to go make a sandwich now. So we needed to do something about that, for sure. And so a lesson that I learned there is it's all about tempo. And this I would say probably was a new lesson to me. I hadn't thought of it in these terms. But the emotionality of the end of a cinematic is wide open. You can have whatever you need for the story. You can have humorous, violent, bittersweet, sad, happy, whatever. All of those are on the table. But the one thing that you can't really modulate or mess with or try to, or be a little off target with is the tempo. The tempo at the end of a cinematic needs to be perfectly matched to whatever the gameplay is going to be. How we did that. Along about now, we came up with a new problem. We were getting feedback about Jim and Sarah's relationship. And it was that people felt like it was too short and sharp of an interaction, that maybe there was no sense that there was anything deeper or greater. So we tried an alternate ending.
The girl you remember is dead. Maybe you're the one who needs to let go.
I moved heaven and earth to bring you back, Sarah. I can't watch you throw that away just for revenge.
Just phase 2 commencing.
I never gave up on you, Sarah. Don't you give up on us!
So, okay. So that didn't work. There were a couple of things we were trying to do there. We were trying to keep the connection between these two alive and establish that there is a real connection, whatever bitterness or fighting they might have, that there is still damage. First of all, it broke the power shift. So that door closes, and Jim's supposed to be gone, and now we're with Sarah. But in this version, we cut around outside, and there's Jim, right? We're bringing him back in. So now, as a viewer, I'm kind of like, oh, maybe this isn't Kerrigan's story after all. Maybe Jim is still the point of view character. And it also messed with the central idea. The end note of this did not leave them in conflict. I mean, on the surface, they're in conflict, but it was a very hopeful note, right? They're going to figure this out. They're going to, look, it gave them emotional parity, right? They had this sort of same equal feeling of sadness and the fact that they want to try to work this out. And the central idea is that they have this conflict based on their two opposing visions of the future. So it messed with that. And really, what it came down to for me was we had to acknowledge the fact that something that can happen with any part of a game, and certainly with a cinematic, is that you tend to work on things in discrete chunks, right? So your time, you know, it was like, well, we need just some hint that there's something more. But actually, for the first cinematic in your game to end with you wanting to know what happens next and wanting more, that's a really good problem to have, right? So it was sort of stepping back and really context of the game. So let's look at the final, and then there's a couple more points to talk about in terms of how it all ended up.
Open the door, son.
Valerian's orders, sir. No visiting.
Open the door.
The test protocol will begin in 2 minutes.
Now give us a minute.
Very well.
We're getting out of here tonight, darling.
Good. Then we can go after Minsk.
I moved heaven and earth to bring you back, Sarah. I can't watch you throw that away just for revenge.
Initiating test phase 2.
I never gave up on you, Sarah. Don't you give up on us!
Test phase 2 commencing.
All right. So one thing just in passing I have to comment on is the value of really good voice actors. So one just small note that we'd gotten a couple times, and it probably was never going to be a big deal, but some people said, well, if Valerian doesn't want Raynor there, why doesn't he just have some Marines drag him away, right, when he gets to the bottom of that strange lift thing that he's on? And the voice actor for Valerian, Josh Keaton, is so good. He managed to get, in saying, "Good morning, Commander," in 3 words, he communicated, "Oh, it's you. I tried to keep you out, but I was..." Having great voice actors solves so many problems for you. So, so the end is up-tempo. And that was if a character starts a cinematic angry, and then they get moved out of anger into something else, and then they go back to anger at the end, that's a bad cinematic, right? Or a bad story, at least, because it's circular. This is the one case where it felt okay because of that central idea. You know, she has her moment of emotional vulnerability, and then the world intrudes on that, and once again gives her yet another reason to be mad. And it just kind of picked up the pace and made you, as soon as you see that angry glow in her eye, you're like, yeah, okay, let's go make some Zerglings. Yeah, and so a lot of times, if you've identified this central idea for the cinematic, it can actually be a really great tool to figure out how to solve problems. You can go back and think about and you're like, oh, hey, I know, and you come up with an idea without thinking about the central idea, you can still take your new solution. That's probably a really good sign that this solution will help you. The central idea should really inform connected from this central idea. It could work, but there's a very high chance, I'd say, that 3 weeks later, you'll be back looking for another solution to that problem. So another lesson, and I know this is like after-school special, the more you know, kind of collaboration, it's good. But I would say that on this particular cinematic, there was a lot of difficulty, a lot of story that had to work in a certain way, a lot of very almost technical things that had to be accomplished. And I would say that one thing that really helped us was the collaboration. Myself and Ben Dye worked together really well, and then there was this broader creative team of very talented people who all had to collaborate. And I'd say one of the big things that I really got from that is the fact that if someone on the team, not committee, because committees have a whole different set of values and problems. But if you have a core creative team and one person on the team has a problem with something and you don't think it's really a problem, it is a problem. You can try to talk them out of it. None of that's ever really going to work. If one of the creative badasses on your team thinks it's a problem, then it really is a problem. And even if you don't think it's a problem, you're going to have to try to find a way to solve it. Because what happens is these things fester, or later you're going to get feedback from some outside group that says the same exact thing. And then that person who said it 3 weeks earlier is going to be like, aha, it was a problem. So what tends to happen with problems that simmer for a long time is then there's an overcorrection, right? There's an overcompensation in the solution. And that tends to go in and smash a lot of other things that were working that you were happy with. So you need to really just embrace the fact that the minute one of your collaborators says, I don't think this thing's a problem, you have to find a way to jump on it and solve it. And basically, the whole cinematic is never going to be finished and never work until every single person that's talk about hopes and fears because, as I say, it's the most difficult cinematic that we had to work on. And it's a strange sort of a situation where we had to define what victory looked like. There were other cinematics, as I said, that I think we instantly knew that we'll make this, and some percentage of players will feel like, that's my favorite cinematic. I don't think any of us ever felt like this cinematic would be anyone's favorite. They'd go, you remember that first one? That was my favorite. Which is not to say that we're not enormously proud of it. I think everybody that worked on it is very proud of it. But we had to figure out how to do a lot of very complex things behind the scenes in a way that would still be entertaining and that people would still enjoy. And so that's what victory looked like. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at bkindregan@blizzard.com. You know, depending on the amount of email I get, I can't necessarily promise a personal response, but I would definitely love to hear feedback. And I hope the talk was useful. You can also follow me on Twitter at Brian Kindregan, I think, but I'm not a good tweeter. So if you want to get like one new tweet a week, then feel free to follow me. Thank you very much.